It has always been one of the special places of the world. A tiny, wind-swept spit of land flung far out onto the surging currents of the North Atlantic, 30 miles off the coast of Cape Cod. A discarded scrap of sand and gravel, an afterthought of the last ice age, bequeathed by the retreating sheets of ice, known to its original inhabitants, who first plied its shallow shoals thousands of years ago as Nantucket, the faraway place. Perched precariously on the far edge of the New World, close to the Gulf Stream and the continental shelf and the track of migrating whales, it has always been a rich and dreaming place. Scoured by wind and wave, hemmed round by treacherous shoals, and washed by complex currents. At once remote and beckoning, insular and cosmopolitan, worldly and homebound. Cut off from the mainland, but connected to the rest of the world. A place of comings and goings, arrivals and departures, of passages and transformations, of vast ambitions, bygone glories, and vanished dreams. Haunted by history and time, by memory and imagination, and by the sea. Continuously inhabited by human beings since the sea first rose up around it 5,000 years ago, the island owes its distinctive poetry and character to the elemental, natural, and human forces that have shaped it, to the epic forces of time and tide, to the remarkable people who have come here, and to the primal calling they made their own, and that would come to define them. Few enterprises have so captured the imagination or so dominated the identity of an entire people. Long after it had passed from the scene, the epic heyday of American whaling would remain a powerful presence on the tiny island of Nantucket, whose extraordinary history remains as palpable to this day and as thrillingly near as the cry of seabirds and the smell of salt air and the thunder of the sea. In the course of its long and eventful history, the 14-mile-long spit of land that Herman Melville called an elbow of sand, all beach without a background, and St. John de Crevecoeur, a barren sandbank fertilized by whale oil only, has been at one time or another the haunt of Wampanoag fishermen, a refuge for persecuted Baptists and Quakers, an unsuccessful sheep farm, the greatest whaling capital in the world, a center of enlightened thought, an island ghost town and sea-washed brigadoon that time forgot, a sleepy artists' colony, a thriving summer resort, and a bellwether for the conservation and environmental movements. An island of new beginnings, what the poet and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson called the nation of Nantucket, set proudly apart from the restlessly striving republic it has epitomized and so often pioneered. Nantucket has been a microcosm of America for more than 350 years. A magnet and a unique laboratory for some of the most powerful impulses animating the New World. Spiritual, commercial, and democratic. A place of stark and subtle beauty, of endurance and creativity, and of continuous transformation and reinvention.
One of the very best ways to see the island is from the air, where you can see the shoals and you can watch them move. And you realize the entire environment is dynamic. There's nothing about it that's standing still. And everything that's being deposited one place is coming from somewhere else.
Nantucket was formed by a glacier 20,000 years ago. Glaciers are conveyor belts for rocks, so you end up with this huge pile of rocks and sand at the end of the glacier, called a terminal moraine. And that's what we are on Nantucket. We're just standing on 1,200 feet of sand. So the island itself is very shifty. It's not going to be here forever. About 19,000 years ago, the glaciers started to retreat. The ocean levels start rising. 6,000 years ago, the ocean cuts Nantucket off from the mainland.
And that's when the magic begins. The waves begin to sculpt the island into a gradually emerging half-moon shape. And Nantucket is being beaten constantly along the south shore by the waves. You get those barrier beaches. The beaches like none other, where it's the ocean coming all the way from Portugal, pounding against the sand. And so Nantucket has always lived on borrowed time. It was created by the sea. In as little as 400 years will be taken by the sea. As a consequence, it's truly a different kind of island.
One of my Nantucket friends used to say, if you can see the ocean can see you. One thing the island makes clear is that nature bats last, and it's far more powerful than we are.
If you look at the UR map, the island is littered with these wonderfully evocative Native American names. And those names, in some ways, are like those early Nantucket settlers' names. Coffin, Starbuck, Gardner, Myacomet, Sconset, Pulpus, Madaket, Madakasham, Quays, an endless array. And we're surrounded by them. They're in our systems. I think it's important to imagine Wampanoag, Nantucket as a thriving, active place. The populations were extremely healthy. They had great food supplies. They were living off the ocean. They were living off of their surroundings. Essentially, they were thriving and healthy people. And they were also extremely welcoming to the Nantucket settlers. Hoping to wrest a livelihood from the island's sandy soil, the first group of newcomers included a merchant and clothier named Thomas Macy and a lumber trader named Edward Starbuck. They were joined by the sprawling families of Tristram Coffin and Peter Folger, and later by the Gardners, the Hussies, the Swains, the Joys, and the Chases. In the centuries to come, their names would be inextricably fused with the history of Nantucket and with the poetry of American whaling and commerce.
They are here to be farmers, raise sheep, but they quickly realize their limits to that. And then they realize they're surrounded by whales in the winter. And they had to hire someone, Ichabod Paddock, to teach them how to do it. But they also had a native population, the Wampanoags, who had been harvesting whales that had washed up on the shore for centuries. And those were the ingredients that led to the blossoming of whaling on Nantucket. This was the beginning of the industrial age, and before petroleum, the oil that was lubricating the machines, lighting the urban centers of America and Europe was whale oil. And before there was mobile oil headquarters, there was Nantucket, and it was Nantucket sperm oil that was making the Industrial Revolution happen and providing the first global economic engine America would know.
The early settlers to Nantucket were not Quakers. They were nonconformists, Baptists, other sects and sympathies, and they had a Quaker conversion around 1702 with an itinerant minister who came here. And a leader of the community, Mary Starbuck, got it. She just got the sense of the inner light, this empowerment of the inner light, and the fact that the Spirit is living within everyone. And then that very quickly came to match up with the whaling endeavor.
There's something about the Quaker religion that breeds a strength of community that the people in Nantucket were able to build upon. They had a very good business sense. They were very hard workers. They had a cohesive social fabric at home, so when the men went off, the women kept the community running and stable.
There's a spirituality to it, there is a sense of social cement and control, and there's a sense of identity. It's a spiritual endeavor. It lent itself to a real religious sense of destiny. You know, Quakers with a vengeance, as Melville would call them. And I think this was a Quaker war when it came to the sperm whale. And it was a little horrifying to see the enthusiasm and sort of this ruthlessness that Nantucketers had when it came to whaling.
Genuine as the Quakers' egalitarian impulse was, nothing about the inner light prevented ship owners from exploiting the local Native American population, many of whom were forced to work off debts by providing labor in the Nantucket whale fishery. Nantucketers would not be able to count for long on their cheap supply of skilled local labor. Disease had already reduced the island's native population to just 358, when in 1763, an epidemic of yellow fever raged across the island. Before it was over, only 136 Wampanoags remained. And by 1800, the Native American presence on the island had been essentially eradicated, forcing Quaker merchants to look elsewhere for cheap labor. To African Americans, free and slave, to Native Americans from the mainland, and to Portuguese mariners already beginning to stream in from the other side of the Atlantic, to man the Nantucket whale ships now pushing out across every ocean on the planet.
Gradually, they push it a little farther until they're going out into the Gulf Stream. And then they go up almost to the Arctic Circle, to the west coast of Africa, down around Cape Horn into the Great Pacific.
As they moved ever further out across the globe, Nantucket's whalemen found themselves increasingly at the forefront of a new era of global enterprise and circumnavigation. When Benjamin Franklin, on the eve of the Revolution, published the first map to chart and name the Gulf Stream, he based his breathtakingly precise projections on information he had obtained from his cousin, Timothy Folger, a veteran Nantucket whaling captain.
1820, Nantucket was poised to enter what would become its golden age, where the entire Pacific would become its backyard. This is a country poised to become what America would eventually become, a world power. And this was now a state-of-the-art industry. I mean, the ships, we think of them as square-rigged, quaint little crafts, but these things were state-of-the-art, decades in development. They were not only the perfect factory ship for rendering the oil, they could go anywhere. They were magnificent exploration vessels, and they lasted pretty darn long under horrible conditions. And yet it was also a home for several dozen men for 3-4 years. And by the 1830s and 40s, Nantucket was the whaling center of the world, and it only lasted for a little more than a century, but it's really what has determined so much of what Nantucket is today.
During Nantucket's heyday as a whaling capital, the little world the Quakers created for themselves in the sea would become a crucible of social tolerance, free thought, and egalitarian belief, and a beacon of serious intellectual inquiry and political debate. In the summer of 1841, a 23-year-old fugitive slave named Frederick Douglass delivered the first fiery speech of his meteoric career as an anti-slavery orator at the annual meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, held on Nantucket at the Athenaeum. His words struck home on the island with particular force, and nowhere more so than in the District of New Guinea, on the outskirts of town, home to a thriving community of Cape Verdeans, Azorians, and free African Americans, including Absalom Boston, the first African American whaleman to captain a whale ship. In 1847, Ralph Waldo Emerson delivered a ringing series of lectures in the Great Hall too, as would distinguished men and women of letters from across the country, including Henry David Thoreau, Horace Mann, and Lucretia Coffin Mott, a Nantucketer.
The really great thing about Quakerism on Nantucket is what it did to empower women. So you have someone like Lucretia Coffin Mott, for example, for whom the Quaker meeting becomes a kind of training ground for speaking up about the moral issues of the day, from slavery to women's suffrage. So it just empowered women in some remarkable ways to take leadership positions, to be educated, to assume roles in the community in a natural way that you didn't see on the mainland.
On a velvety black night in 1847, from the observatory her father had built for her, on the roof of the Pacific National Bank on Main Street, Maria Mitchell made the discovery that would catapult her to world fame as one of the greatest astronomers of the 19th century.
We always show to people the photograph of the moon where there's a little crater named after Maria Mitchell. And I always tell people this crater is the size of Nantucket.
Shadows were already starting to fall on Nantucket's glory days as a whaling capital, when in the summer of 1852, a 33-year-old one-time whaleman and writer named Herman Melville set foot on the island for the first time. A year after completing his soaring masterpiece, Moby Dick, one of the greatest works of literature ever written by an American, inspired in large part by the island itself and the extraordinary enterprise that had flourished there so spectacularly. With the landless gull that at sunset folds her wings and is rocked to sleep between billows, so at nightfall, the Nantucketer, out of sight of land, furls his sails and lays him to his rest, while under his very pillow rush herds of walruses and whales. Herman Melville.
Well, Nantucket's really two things. There's a time when it was the whaling capital of the world. This was big business. This was America's first global economy, and this little island was the center of it. They were sending out dozens upon dozens of ships around the world, bringing back incredible wealth to the island, sending out their whale oil to the industrial centers around the world. And Nantucketers were really showing America how it would one day become a world power. And then it all blew up. Whaling began to decline.
For years, the shallow sandbar at the mouth of Nantucket Harbor had proved an increasing impediment to whale ships, as the voyages grew longer and the ships grew larger with ever deeper drafts. When in 1846, the first of a series of devastating blows rained down upon the industry that had been the island's staff of life for 150 years.
In 1846, the fire breaks out, the Great Fire, and destroys a third of Nantucket's town, all of the waterfront. They rebuilt very quickly, but they could see the writing on the wall. And so when gold was discovered in California, the Nantucketers evacuated the island virtually. They took their whale ships, crammed them full of 49ers, sailed around the Horn, and literally abandoned the ships at the Golden Gate. They're still finding whale ships when they build new skyscrapers in downtown San Francisco.
The real bottom of the whale oil market fell out in the late 1850s when they discovered petroleum in the hills of Pennsylvania that could be turned into a flood of cheap kerosene. And almost overnight, the whale oil industry went into steep decline.
1859, they discovered petroleum. 1861 is the beginning of the Civil War. And with the Civil War comes the loss of so many whale ships. They were an easy target for the Confederate raiders. Plus, approximately 45 whale ships were sunk in the two stone fleets off of Charleston and Savannah.
The war took a heartbreaking human toll, too. Before it was over, some 300 Nantucketers had joined the Union Army and gone south. 73 of them would never see home again. And so the age of whaling on Nantucket faded away and passed into the realm of memory and myth. And yet, even as the island fell into a deep and dreaming sleep, something extraordinary began to occur.
It's a fascinating period on Nantucket. You have this incredible global industry that had just died, and then you have basically a ghost town. But out of that ghost town springs this growing awareness about the history that had just passed and that was now slowly starting to fade. So you have this great generation of Nantucketers who are the children and grandchildren of the whalers, and they're surrounded by history. They're surrounded by candle factories, by paintings, by scrimshaw, and these things are, in many cases, literally in their attics. And so they're thinking about the recent past. And what do? They form a historical association to preserve that. They start to gather all these whaling logs and manuscripts. They look into their recent history and genealogy, and they start to really build a community out of the ashes of the old community.
By the dawn of the 20th century, a remarkable transformation was underway. One that would quicken as the century wore on, as Nantucketers began to reinvent and reimagine their island, redirecting energies that had once gone into whaling, into preserving and celebrating its rich history and natural beauty, repurposing along the way the island's incomparable historic infrastructure. Fishermen's shacks and scallop shanties that lined the weathered wharves on the waterfront were converted into artist studios or remodeled and rented to the steadily increasing number of summer visitors. Around town, older houses and commercial properties that bore witness to the island's past were painstakingly rehabilitated and brought to life, including an old candle factory at the foot of Broad Street, where spermaceti oil from the head of sperm whales had once been processed into the brilliant, smokeless candles prized by Thomas Jefferson, and which now became the source of a different kind of light, as the headquarters of Nantucket's Historical Association and the home of the Whaling Museum, the gateway and anteroom to the wonders of the best-preserved seaport town in America. The entire 4-century arc of the island's stirring history is summarized and preserved in 4 eloquent structures maintained by the Nantucket Historical Association. Here at the top of Sunset Hill stands the oldest house, the most prominent of the surviving structures from the island's 17th century settlement. Built in 1686 as a wedding gift to Jethro Coffin and his bride, Mary Gardner. On Prospect Street, just 1 mile away, stands the Old Mill, the oldest working mill in America. Built in 1746, one of 5 that once stood like giant sentinels on the hills above the harbor. A thrilling architectural monument to the age of agriculture and sail on Nantucket. On the proudest stretch of Main Street stands the Hadwin House, a monumental Greek Revival mansion built by a whaling merchant in 1846, at the very zenith of Nantucket's whaling might, just before the downturn came. And on a quiet lane called Howard Street, deceptively close to the center of town, stands Greater Light, an old livestock barn converted to an artist's salon in the 1920s by 2 eccentric Quaker sisters from Philadelphia, Gertrude and Hannah Monahan, who moved to the island on the eve of the crash and helped redefine the meaning of Nantucket's inner light for a new generation of Nantucketers.
Nantucket does transport you in a way. You feel the past, you feel a presence. You feel like you're coming out of the sea, looking around at the globe for the first time and not quite sure what to make of it. And it's complex, it's a hard to describe experience. There's an energy, it's unsettling, but it can also be extremely exhilarating. I think a lot of people come back to this island and try to feel that over and over. And it has something to do with the forces of an island 30 miles out to sea that has been the basis of things that are rich, strange, and that really foretell in many ways, I think, whatever the future will be. And that's the great mystery we all have lurking.